Good evening. No extra credit for guessing the connection between this week's Sidra and this week's Haftarot. It's a rather obvious one for two reasons, one big one and one small one. The big one is, of course, is that both the Sidra and the Haftarah feature reconnaissance missions. The small reason is that they actually share a character, and that is Yehoshua. Yehoshua is one of the scouts who goes on the reconnaissance mission back during the wilderness days, and in the Haftarah, he is the leader of the Jewish nation who dispatches his own reconnaissance mission as they are about to cross the Jordan and undertake the conquest of the land of Israel. So the Haftarah is from the second chapter of the book of Joshua, and it starts with the very first pasuk in that chapter, which, as you see here, is essentially just a bit of the background, a prologue. Vayishlach Yoshua bin Nun min ha-Shittim, that from a place called Shittim, which was just across the Jordan River on the east bank, a place that we know, or actually, I'm presumptuous if I say that we know, because it isn't going to show up until 3 weeks from now. It has to say, in the sequence of the weekly Torah readings, Shittim does not become prominent in the Sidra of Balak. That's the place where the Israelites dallied with the Midianite women. So that places it close to the Jordan River on the east bank. So from there, Yehoshua sent two Shnayim Anashim, two men, Meragalim, spies, Cheresh, secretly, quietly, Lemor, saying to them, giving them their instructions, L'chu re'u et ha'aretz, go and look about the land, ve'et Yericho, and particularly Jericho, which was their first military target on the west bank of the Jordan. And we're told Vayelochu, so the two spies obeyed their instructions. They went. Vayavo beit isha zona ushmah rachav vayishkevu shama. And they entered the city of Jericho, and they spent the night, or they went to sleep. They took up lodging in the house of a Zonah woman named Rachav. We'll get to everything one piece at a time. So if we compare this to the beginning of this week's Torah reading, we can immediately see several striking differences. And we're rather relieved to see the striking differences because, to use a biblical expression, oy v'avoy, if Yehoshua had not learned from the previous experience of the 12 scouts. So first of all, instead of sending 12 people, he sent 2. You know the old adage about what is a camel? A camel is a horse made by a committee, right? The more people you have on the committee, arguably, the less consensus, or the more difficult it is to achieve a consensus. And Yehoshua and Kalev experienced that personally when they found themselves in a minority facing the 10 scouts who brought back negative reports of the land of Israel. So here Yehoshua decides that it doesn't have to be representative. There's no need to send 12 people, one representing each tribe, as though somehow it were political rather than strategic in value. And he sends only 2 people. Interestingly, they're not identified, but we'll shortly see that there is an attempt at least to identify one of them. Second difference is that when Moshe sent them, Moshe did not use the word l'ragel. The word that you see highlighted in yellow in the text from Bimidbar, from this week's Torah reading, is viyaturu et eretz Canaan, to scout out the land. In modern Hebrew, tayarim are tourists. Yoshua specifically sends people l'ragel, to spy. So that one might assume that while, as I hinted, that the delegation that Moshe sent may have been chosen for its political acumen, for being the elected, or if not elected, appointed representatives of the 12 tribes, but they weren't particularly well suited for a military reconnaissance. If Yoshua sent Meraglim, we can assume that the people he sent were singularly suited for this purpose. They were perhaps professional soldiers rather than being professional communal leaders. The other point is the emphasis in the word that's highlighted in red, cheresh, quietly, secretly. Again, learning from his previous experience, if everybody is sitting around biting their nails, awaiting the report of the scouts, then it's very difficult to imagine how you can tell them something that's going to please all of them, because they've been sitting there for as long as the scouts have been away, trying to figure out what is it that they're going to say, what are their expectations. And if people have 40 days in which to build up their expectations, it's very difficult then to meet those kinds of expectations. So Yoshua simply sent them secretly. Nobody knew that they went. Nobody was sitting around, again, to use a biblical expression, sittering, right? Nobody was sitting around nervously awaiting their return, so that people weren't forming expectations which there might be difficulty in meeting. Okay. However, the term that, again, is repeated is Re'u et ha'aretz. Yoshua's instruction to the two spies was, you see, it's translated in English as reconnoiter the region. I guess, ein bet midrash b'li chidush. I guess that to simply say, look out, look at the land, observe the land, even spy out the land, just seemed to be a little too droll. So somebody had to come up with reconnoiter. Okay. And that's the same term in the same instruction that Moses gave the 12 scouts before they departed. You can see again the highlight in green. Uri'item et ha'aretz, his instructions to them were again to see what kind of country it is. It's interesting, of course, that it's the same Jewish publication society that translated Sefer Bimidbar and translated Sefer Yehoshua. So why in Sefer Bimidbar it was okay to say, see what kind of country it is, but by the time they got to the first chapter of Yehoshua, it had to be reconnoiter the region. I don't know. But in any event, okay. Now we finally get to the question of in whose home did they take up lodging for the night? It's a woman named Rach, and she's described in the text as an Isha Zonah. Now, the question of whether an Isha Zonah means a harlot is open to question. If you see the sources that are highlighted in kind of purplish, first of all, I brought the Aramaic Targum. The venerable Aramaic Targum of Yehoshua renders Isha Zonah as Itisa, that's the standard Aramaic word for a woman, but he translates Zonah as Pundakisa. Pundak, even in modern Hebrew, is an inn, not a fancy hotel, more like a hostel, right? Hostel, right? And an itisa pundakisa would be an innkeeper. Now, if you're wondering, how do you get an innkeeper out of the word zonah? So just bear in mind that the shoresh that produces zonah and zinut, harlotry, also produces the word mazon, vittles. So arguably, a zona is a woman who provides vittles for people. Okay, and since in those days we probably didn't have, restaurants or fast food emporia, where would you go for a meal? You'd go to a place that offered lodging and food. So arguably, the rendition of Isha Zona as Itisa Pundakisa is tolerable. Okay, and indeed, Rashi follows in the lead of the Targum. He cites the Targum, Pundakiso Metargaminon, telling us that the Aramaic Targum rendered it as an innkeeper. And in case our Aramaic isn't up to snuff, Rashi then paraphrases it in Hebrew, Mocheret mine mizonot, someone who sells or provides different kinds of food. Okay, and in some versions of Rashi, you see the addition in the brackets, Kemo chenvanit. A chenvanit is a storekeeper. Okay, if you wish, a grocer. Okay. Radak is not quite persuaded by it, but he recognizes the validity of the association of the word zona with mazon, meaning food. So he tries to bridge the two interpretations by saying, Vida'ato, lefisha hazona ki fundikita, that a harlot resembles an innkeeper. Why? Shemafkeret atzma lako. Maybe because she's too much of a public person. She interacts with the public more than is considered modest or something like that. Okay, I would like to think that Rachav was an innkeeper. She certainly, as we'll see in the continuation of the story, does not act in a way that we would expect or associate with a harlot. Okay. As you see from the next installment, she actually saves the spies from the Jericho police force. So we continue. Somebody told the king of Jericho, doesn't really matter who it was, that Israelites have entered the city of Jericho, lachpor et haaretz. Now there's an interesting term, and I highlighted it in green in order to match it up with the green in the previous text box. In the previous text box, the green highlighted the instructions to the spies, re'u et haaretz, or the instructions to the earlier spies, u're'item et haaretz, to spy out the land. How do you spy out the land? Arguably, that's the same thing that is intended here or meant by lachpor et haaretz. And you see indeed that here, the English translation is to spy out the country. Now, literally, lachpor means to dig. Okay? Why do you dig? You dig when you're not satisfied with or when your objective lies beneath the surface. So indeed, the spies were not only there, as it were, to take pictures of things in the country and show everybody what it looked like, but rather their assignment, their responsibility, or it was understood implicitly, that they would, if necessary, look beneath the surface. Hence, they're described as lachpor et haaretz. And it seems that not only is the king of Jericho informed that there are Israelite spies in Jericho, but somebody even knows where they are. Because the king immediately in the next verse sends a message or messengers to Rachav saying, Hotzii ha'anashim haba'im elayich asher ba'u leveitech. Turn out the people who came to your house, ki lachpor et kol haaretz ba'u, because they intend us harm. They are here on a spying mission to scout out the land. However, rather than complying with the instructions of the king of Jericho, what does Rachav do in verse 4? Vatikach ha'isha et shnei ha'anashim. She took the two Israelite spies, vatitzpeno, and she hid them. Vatomer, and then she turned to the police, the soldiers, whoever it was, who came on the orders of the king, and said to them, Cain, of course, yes. It's indeed true. There were two Israelite spies here earlier, right? Or at least there were two strangers here. Lo yadati me'ayin hema. But if you're telling me that these are Israelites and they were spies, how was I to know? Meaning, it's clear that if the police or the army made a beeline for her door and said, we know that there are two Israelite spies here, there was no point in her denying that there were two strangers there. So in order to allay their suspicions, she immediately says, yes, right, there were two people who took up lodging in my inn, which is another reason I said to support the contention that she was an innkeeper, right? Two people took up lodging in my inn, right? But I guess the custom in Jericho in those days was that if you took a night's lodging, you didn't have to show your passport. So she could maintain, lo yadati me'ayin hema, I didn't know where they come from. Okay. Vayi hashar lisgor b'choshech. When it drew close to nighttime and it was about time to close and lock the gates of the city, vanashim yatsa'u, right? She says, the men left. Lo yadati ana halchu ha'anashim. Meaning, she says, they were here for a while, but when they saw that the city gates were about to be closed for the night, they departed. Okay. Lo yadati ana halchu ha'anashim. I don't know where they went. However, she says to them, ridufu maher achareihem. If you pursue them quickly, tasigum, surely you'll catch up to them. Okay. Now, implicitly, at this moment in time, the police, the soldiers, leave. Okay. So that she's now able, right, having hidden them, she now takes them, ha'alatam hagaga, she takes them up onto the roof of her house, vatitmeneim b'fishtei ha'etz ha'aruchot la al hagag, and she hides them under some stalks of flax that were lying out, probably to dry, on her roof. Okay. And vanashim radafu achareihem, the police, the army, whoever it was, pursued. Right. They couldn't have really pursued the spies because we know that the spies were hiding on her roof, but they were at least following her instructions, and they had left the city, right, and were in ostensible pursuit of the spies. Derech hayarden al hama'abrot, since they knew them to be or presumed them to be Israelite spies, they knew that they would be heading back to the Jordan River. So they headed to the Jordan, to one of the crossings, one of the fords, that is to say, a place that is easy to cross over. Vahashar, and when we're talking about the gate of the city, that it was now evening and it was time for the gate to be closed, sagaru, they locked the gate of the city. Acharei ka'asher yatzeu harodefim achareihem. This is a rather difficult phrase. We'll get to it in due time. It says that after the pursuers left the city to chase after the spies, they closed and locked the gates of the city. Kind of locking the old proverb about locking the barn doors after the cow has already left, or the horse, or whichever animal it is. Okay. Okay, so first of all, the term lachpor et haaretz, literally, as I said, to look beneath the surface, is again one that we will have an acquaintance with when we get to the Sidra of Devarim. In the first parak of Devarim, there is a recapitulation of the story of the scouts that Moses sent. And there, the term that's used to describe the intended activities of these scouts is not v'yaturu et haaretz, to scout about, right, which could be somewhat of a perfunctory visit, but rather the term is used v'yachperu lanu et haaretz, implying the same kind of investigation that is explicit here in the story of the two spies in Jericho. And since we're on the subject of spying, right, the term lir'ot, to look for the land, actually combines with the notion of lachpor, to look beneath the surface, in the accusation that Joseph leveled against his brothers. If you remember way back then, when Joseph discovered that his brothers had come to Egypt to purchase grain, he had them arrested and accused them of being spies. So here is the verse, Vayizkor Yosef et hachalomot asher chalam lahem, that when Joseph recalled the dreams that he had dreamt about his brothers, Vayomer aleihem, he said to them, Meraglim atem, right? You are spies. And then he paraphrases himself and he says, Lirot et ervat haaretz batem. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. You've come to see the land exposed. Just as nakedness is something that is ordinarily kept under cover, so you don't see it unless you remove cover. So arguably, the result of lachpor et haaretz, to dig beneath the surface, is identical with lirot et ervat haaretz, to see something that is customarily kept hidden. And while we're on the subject of hiding, so you may have noticed here, it's not a scratch on your computer screen or on mine. I drew a line to connect the word vatitzpeno in verse 4 to the word vatitmeneim in verse 6. So there are two questions. It would appear, first of all, first question is, how many times did she hide them? And the answer is, she would appear to have hidden them twice. She hid them once, and there are no specifics given about where they were hidden or how they were hidden. And that was while the Jericho police were at her door. The second time that she hid them was after the police had departed. And here we know how she hid them and where she hid them. She hid them on her roof, and she hid them by covering them with the stalks of flax. The other issue is, how many of them did she hide? Now, you'll say, what do you mean, how many of them did she hide? There were two of them, she had to have hidden two of them. It certainly would have served no purpose to have hidden one and not hidden the other. And yet, if you look carefully, the word vatitzpeno in verse 4 literally means she hid him, while vatitmeneim in verse 6 means she hid them. So the question is, how could she have hidden only one of them the first time and yet hidden two of them the second time? By the way, you see that the English translation has them in both instances, and it's a curiosity. I looked up a score of English translations, and every single one of them translates vatitzpeno as hid them. And yet, as I said, technically speaking, it's a problem, okay? So, first of all, again, not only the English translations, but again, our venerable Aramaic Targum renders vatitzpeno as va'atmarat nun. Tamir, tet mem resh, is Aramaic for hidden. Okay, so at martun, it's the hif'il form, the causative form of the verb to hide. She hid them. So even the Aramaic Targum renders vatitzpeno as she hid them in the plural, just like the later English translations. But yet we see that the medieval and modern exegetes weren't satisfied that easily. Let's look first at Rashi. Okay. First of all, Rashi says, Yesh mikraot shemedabrim al harabim ki yachid. Rashi says, no big deal. This isn't the only place in the Bible in which something we know to be a plural subject is grammatically singular. And if you want to know, so why use the grammatical singular here instead of the grammatical plural? So he gives an explanation. Lefisha mihara bahatmanatam. First of all, because she had to hide them quickly. Bi b'makom tsar. She had to hide both of them in a very small place of concealment. And therefore, the fact that she was able to do it, A, so quickly, and B, in such a small space, it's ki'ilu haya yachid, as though she were only hiding one person. Meaning she did it as quickly and as effectively as if she had been hiding only one person, even though we really know that she was hiding two. But then Rashi tells us, umidrash haggadah, that the Midrash treated or solved this problem in its own typical fashion by telling us that, in fact, she really only hid one of them. But I asked the obvious question, what good it have done to have hid only one of them and to have the other one discovered? So Midrash says that the two meraglim, who are not identified in the biblical text, were Pinchas and Kalev. Now, I pause here for a moment, though I'm sure you're already reading the end of Rashi. I pause here for a moment to point out that, again, this seems to be another lesson that Joshua learned from the earlier experience of the scouts. If Kalev had already proven himself to be a loyal and stalwart partisan of God, who was even willing to stand up against 10 of his peers in defense of the proposition that they would be able to conquer the land, then if he needed another spying mission, then who was a more ideal person than Kalev, who had not only demonstrated his loyalty, but had the additional advantage of knowing his way around the land? The choice of Pinchas, the Kohen, as the second Meragel would also make sense. It would make sense because he's also somebody of demonstrable loyalty. Again, we're not going to get to it for another several weeks, but when we get to the Sidra of Pinchas, we'll learn that it was Pinchas who seized the initiative and, as it were, sought to avenge the blot on God's reputation, on the reputation of the people of Israel that was caused when one of the Nisiyim, one of the princes of Israel, took up with one of the Midianite princesses, and that God in turn vouchsafed him a Brit Kehuna, a priestly covenant, a Brit Shalom, a peaceful covenant. So Pinchas is also somebody. If Pinchas came back, whatever Pinchas would have reported, surely the people would have accepted his word for it. However, identifying Pinchas as one of the two meraglim serves the Midrash another purpose, and that is Pinchas amad lifneihem velo ra'uhu, that Pinchas could make himself invisible. Make himself invisible? What was he, an angel? Yeah. Lefi shehaya kemalach, because he could make himself invisible like an angel. Now, if you think this is an outlandish notion, I'm not going to try to persuade you otherwise, but I will, however, point out that it's a biblical verse. It's actually a biblical verse that we encountered in a Haftarah that we looked at together. It's the Haftarah that comes from the third and final chapter of the book of Malachi. And the pasuk says, "Ki siftei chohen yishmeru da'at," that the lips, or the mouth, the speech of a kohen preserve knowledge. Therefore, Torah yakshu mipihu, people will come to the kohanim to receive instruction in the Torah. Why? Ki malach Hashem tzvaotu, because the kohen, arguably any kohen, is an angel. Now, of course, angel doesn't always mean, a figure dressed in white with wings and a halo and carrying a harp. An angel literally just means a messenger. And the pasuk probably just means that Kohanim, by teaching the people Torah, are serving as God's messengers, as God's agents. But if you take the verse literally, it does say that Kohanim are malachim. And therefore, according to the Midrash, the solution to the problem of how she could have hidden only one of them and not been concerned that the other would be discovered is simply by virtue of the fact that the second meragel was invisible. Rashi himself doesn't seem to be too taken with this idea, because he quickly tells us, davar acher, there's another way out of this dilemma, and that is to explain that vatitz peno, she hid him, means, kol echad ve'echad b'fnei atzmo. She hid him, and she hid him. Meaning, rather than hiding them both in the same place, she hid them separately. Okay. Radak, Ralbag essentially say the same thing, just in the constraints of time. Malbim, however, our 19th century exegete, takes a bit of a different approach. One of the things that it characterizes Malbim's approach to biblical interpretation is his insistence on precision in defining words. Whereas earlier exegetes, like Ibn Ezra, like Radak, would often explain certain words as being synonymous, and if they were synonymous, they would treat them as though they had the identical meaning. Malbim insists that even synonyms are distinct. And therefore, every time a verse uses a pair of synonyms, Ibn Ezra and Radak will treat the synonyms as though they were identical, and Malbim will, as it were, take a philological scalpel and parse the synonyms and tell you how they are similar yet not identical. So here he asks two questions about our verse. Number one, why did Scripture describe their hiding twice? And second, first it uses the singular, she hid him, and subsequently the plural, she hid them. So the first thing that he does is to distinguish between hiding and hiding. See, or if you wish, if I were trying to say it in English, I would say the difference between hiding and concealing. You can hide something without concealing it. Arguably, it's much more difficult to conceal something and it not be hidden, but you could hide something without being concealed. Here's Malbim. There's a difference between the verb tzafan and the verb taman. Remember, it says vatitz peno, and then it says vatit menem. So he says that tzafon, tzadi peinun, means to stand in a place that cannot be seen. Okay? Even if you're not concealed, you're not covered up with something, but you're standing off to a side where you're not visible. Okay? Tamon, on the other hand, is someone who is concealed. who's covered either with a disguise or, as it were, covered up with dirt. So, he says, when the king's officers suddenly showed up, Rachav did not have time to disguise them, to conceal them, to cover them up, as she was later able to do with the stalks of flax. Rather, she was able only to hide them. That is, to station them in a corner off to the side where they could not be seen immediately or easily. She was also unable to put them both in one place, because if they were seen, they might be recognized as the two spies, because the police were told to look for a pair of spies. Therefore, she put each one in a separate corner, so that even if one were discovered, right, they might say, why are you hiding in the corner? But since they were looking for a pair of spies, if they found only one person, it might not occur to them that this was one of the spies. Finally, since it was conceivable that if a search was conducted, they would discover the pair, she had another tactic. And that, as I already alluded to, was she confessed. She said, yes, there were two people here, strangers, but she quickly said they had already left. Her intention was that the pursuers would quickly leave her home to chase them. So she said to them, yes, the men came to me. In other words, just as you suspected, right? Because immediately upon their arrival, they began to question me in the manner of spies. She also said, Lo yadati me'ayin hema. I didn't know where they came from, because occasionally recognizable people would come and inquire about local affairs. So to simply say to two people in here and they were asking about, the city, or asking about, this and that, in and of itself was not evidence that they were spies. It might have just been a coincidence. That's not the case with foreigners of unknown origin. Why would they make inquiries about the land? Additionally, the fact that they withheld their place of origin and where they were coming from, right, was indicative of their being spies. So as we said, this is what she did in order to throw off the suspicion from herself. Then there was the phrase that I pointed out at the end of the previous passage, which is very difficult to understand literally. V'hashar sagaru, they closed or locked the gate. Then it says, when did this happen? Acharei, after, ka'asher, when, yatz'u harodfim achareihem, the pursuers had gone out after them. Now, you can close the gate after the pursuers left. You can close the gate when the pursuers left. What does it mean to close the gate after when the pursuers left to pursue them? So Radak, first of all, explains who's doing the closing. Is it the Meraglim? Is it the spies? Is she saying the spies left and they closed the gate behind themselves? Or is she saying that after the police left, Anshe Habayit, her householders, right, went out and closed the gate? And Radak says that the latter interpretation is the correct one, because it couldn't have been the spies, because by now she had taken and concealed them on the roof, and they would not have come down from the roof out of fear of being discovered. Now, that takes care of who closed the gate. What about this awkward when, after? So he explains as follows. If the verse had only said, Acharei asher yatzeu, after the pursuers left, it would appear that there was a passage of considerable time, that it was some time later. but they didn't delay in closing the gate on account of their fear. On the other hand, if it had said they closed the gate when they left, without saying after, it would appear that they closed the gate immediately upon their exit from the city. But if they had done that, then the pursuers would have realized that there were spies hidden there. Rather, he suggests that the awkward expression, they closed it when after they left, was to imply that they closed it only after the pursuers had gone some distance from the gate, so that they would not realize that the gate had been closed, because that might have tipped them off to the fact that Rachav's householders were trying to hide something from them. Okay. So the spies and Rachav are up on the roof of her house. Okay. And she goes up to join them, and she says to them something very interesting. In verse 9, Yada'ati, I know, ki natan Hashem lachem et haaretz, that God will give you the land, he will enable you to conquer it. V'chi nafela eimatechem aleinu, and indeed everybody is afraid of you. V'chi namogu kol yoshvei haaretz mipnechem, and that all of the inhabitants of the land of Canaan are trembling before you. Okay. How would she know that? Why would she presume that? And she says, Ki shamanu et asher hovish Hashem et meyam suf mipnechem. He says, what do you think? She said, we didn't hear about the crossing of the sea. We know, she says, we heard that God dried up the waters of the sea when you left Egypt. Okay? That was 40 years ago. But we know even more recent news. We know Asher asitem l'shnei malachei ha'emori asher be'ever ha'yarden. We know about your more recent successes in conquering the two kings of Transjordan, Sichon and Og, Asher hecheramtem otam, that you utterly destroyed them. Vanishmaim, when we heard about this, vayimas lo avenu, our hearts melted. V'lo kama od ruach beish mipnechem, and nobody, we were dispirited. Ki Hashem Elohechem hu Elohim b'shamayim mima'al v'ala aretz mitachat, because we are indeed persuaded that your God is indeed the God of heaven and earth. And therefore, she says, since I know that your conquest of the land of Canaan and of the city of Jericho are a foregone conclusion, I want you to do me a favor, she says. Va'ata hishav'una li b'Hashem. She wants them to take a solemn oath that in exchange for the favor that she did by hiding them and preserving their lives, v'asitem gamatem im beit avi chesed, that you should do a favor to me in return, unatatem li ot emet, and that you should give me a sign that you will indeed perform this favor. And the favor she requests in verse 13 is, V'hachayitem et avi ve'et imi ve'et achai ve'et achyotai ve'et kol asher lahem. That when you come as a conquering army and you succeed in conquering the city of Jericho, you should spare the lives of my father and mother and my brothers and sisters and all of their families. And they take the oath and they say, Nafshenu tachtechem lamut. The two spies say to Rachav that they pledge their own lives in defense of hers, but they impose a reasonable condition. Im lo tagidu et dvarenu zeh, you have to keep this a secret between us. Vaya b'teit Hashem lanu et haaretz, and indeed when God gives us the land, v'asinu imach chesed ve'emet, we will do you this genuine favor. I don't know, it's interesting. First of all, the phrase namogu kol yoshvei haaretz mipnechem is very interesting because it comes from Az Yashir, it comes from the Song at the Sea, in which it says, right, it anticipates, right, it's kind of prophetic. It says that when the news of the crossing of the sea gets to the princes of Edom and to the princes of Moab, that is to say that when it makes its way to the 6 o'clock news, so to speak, Yochazemo Ra'ad, they will all tremble. And it even uses the words Namogul Kol Yoshvei Canaan, that all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan will quake, they will tremble. Okay? And furthermore, it's interesting that when the Torah describes the victory of the Jewish people, the more recent victory over the kings of Transjordan, Sichon and Og, you can see in verse 6 here that it even uses the word Vanacharem Otam, that they were destroyed utterly, exactly the term that was used by Rachav in her reference to it. But there's something else here that I did not anticipate myself, and I am indebted to this rather unusual commentary that I just came across. If you look at the highlighted section here in yellow, Rachav wants the spies to take an oath that they will preserve the lives of her father and mother and brothers and sisters and all of their families. Do you see who's missing? Well, Rabbi Moshe Ashkenazi, an Italian commentator of the mid to late 19th century, spotted something missing. And he said, V'nei matzanu, we see, Sherachav, right? Our innkeeper, Afapi sheyoshevet levada babayit, though she appears to be at home alone, hishbi'a et hamraglim, she administered the oath to them, sheyechayu, that they should keep alive, aviha v'ima ushar kroveha, v'lo hizkira ba'ala. She doesn't say, and my husband. Now, the suggestion, of course, would be that she was unmarried, which may very well be something that we could introduce into evidence if we were to go back and to reopen the question of what is an Isha Zona. Okay. Now the spies make their escape. She lowers them down through the window with a rope. And how is she able to do this? Because Beita, her house, Bekir HaChoma, was situated in the wall of the wall. And that's a tough one too, right? In modern Hebrew, a kir is a wall. A choma is also a wall. Choma is usually the outer wall of the city. One ordinarily does not refer to the wall of a house as a choma. The wall of a house is a kir, right? It's the outer wall of the city that is a choma. So what does it mean to have a house that's situated in the wall of the city wall? Okay, so Malbim, again, to the rescue. He says that her house was outside the city wall, and the city wall served as a wall of her house. Meaning, if you can imagine it in your mind's eye, that her house was built on the far side of the city wall so that she only had to put up 3 walls. The rear wall of her house was the wall of the city. Okay? That's why it says, Beita Bekir HaChoma, right? Her house wasn't literally inside the wall of the city, but the wall of the city served as a wall of her house. Okay. Her house was tucked into the wall, so to speak, so that the wall surrounded it on three sides, and that gave her a window that opened outwards and already was outside of the city, that hence ubachomahi yoshevet, okay, that she dwelt, as it were, in the wall. And according to the Malbim, this also explains something else. When Joshua and the people take the city of Jericho, as you remember, right? Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Well, if the walls came tumbling down, then it would already be too late to spare the lives of Rahab and her family. Because arguably, right, if the walls of the city collapsed, then, it's too late. So Malbim points out that by virtue of his explanation, that her house was not situated in the wall of the city, but it was kind of like an adjunct to the wall of the city. That explains how the wall of the city could collapse, and yet Rahab's house remains standing, so that, as we will read later, the two men, the spies, were able to go into her house and to rescue her and her family. And by the way, since I see we're drawing to a close anyway, I should just point out that according to another midrash, Rahab actually ends up marrying Joshua. Okay. In any event, the spies agreed to her oath to provide a rescue for her and her family, and they stipulate exactly how it is to be effected. The rope, which apparently was red in color, that she had used to lower them down, or that she would use to lower them down from her window, was to be tied in the window of her house. And that would serve as a sign. At this point in time, they don't know that they are going to be the ones who will be given the mission to rescue Rahab and her family. Therefore, they're making it possible for anybody to carry out the rescue mission, because they would be able to identify Rahab's apartment by the presence of the bright red rope that would be hanging in the window. And finally, the spies return and they give their report. And as again, the Haftarah ends with V'gam namogu kol yoshvei haaretz mipanenu, and that again is a repetition of the verse that we saw earlier in this chapter, and that we referred back to the song at the sea that described again the inhabitants of the land of Canaan as trembling at the approach of the Israelites. Well, okay, wow, lots of chatting today. Yes, somebody asked at the beginning, no husband or children. So I'm very glad that we were able to anticipate that with this 19th century Italian commentary. Okay. How did she have access to the city? It may very well be that she had to go through the city gate in order to get into the city. I would have asked a better question. I would have asked, maybe somebody else did for all I know. I would have asked the question about how could she be protected by the city wall if the city wall was effectively behind her house and not in front of it? But then again, look, where would you, if you were building a hotel, where would you build it? Okay, there is certainly an advantage to building a hotel in Midtown, because if people are coming to town primarily to do business, and Midtown is the business district, then a hotel in the business district is convenient. If, however, people are coming for other purposes, right, then Midtown is maybe the worst place in which to situate a hotel, because it takes so long to get in and out of Midtown that if you're a tourist and you have to give an hour each way to get in back and forth from your hotel, you lose time. So situating a hotel at the entrance to the city, by the city gate, in the city wall, makes sense. I should add that it also makes sense that is where a house of ill repute would be situated, so that people could come and go without having to enter the city, so that if in fact they did not want their comings and goings to become a matter of public knowledge, then there were ways of getting in and out of Rachav's apartment without being seen. Okay. What else? Yeah, somebody,
If you go up a little bit, your questions, I think you started at the bottom instead of at the top.
No, I went. I mean, these aren't questions. They're observations or notes. I mean,
So who closed the gate and when? I think that was the one.
as
So
I said, we did that.
clarification.
We anticipated that.
That's okay.
Yeah, we anticipated that. Yeah. As I said, Malbim's explanation was a good one. That Rachav wanted the pursuers to get far enough away that when she told her householders to close the gate to the city, it wouldn't attract the attention of the pursuers, because if they saw the gates being closed behind them, they might be suspicious.
Okay.
Well, again, a Kohen in a brothel, what is it? No atheists in a foxhole? I guess, something like that. I won't ask whose comment that was. Assuming the roof is the highest one in that area, no one can see. Again, if this was on the far side of the city wall from where people customarily lived, it didn't have to be higher. The city wall was higher, and it interfered with anybody trying to look in on Rachav's house. Yes. Okay. All right. That's about it.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll see you next week, Parshat Korach. And all right, getting all the, the stories of the downfall of Jewish people. What can I say in the desert? Anyways, okay, Bekasha, thank you. Tomorrow morning, Shuli Mishkin begins her series. What do we call it exactly? We titled it "Come Walk the Land: Regions in Israel and Their Stories." So starting tomorrow at 11 a.m. If you haven't registered, please do so. Tomorrow night at 8:30, our Parsha Shir is given by Rabbi Noah Chezis of Sharon, Massachusetts. Sharon, and that's tomorrow night at 8:30. And Friday morning at 9:30, I'll be giving the Pirkei Avot Shir. Then Sunday, Rabbi Liebtag on Sefer Dvarim, and working through the weeks of Shirim. So we look forward to seeing you and learning with you. Everybody have a nice night. Be well, and good things. Let's hear good things. Okay. Laila Tov, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Sokolow.
Thank you, Yeshkaya.